Hello everyone. Today my colleagues and I will start giving summaries and analyzing the chapters we have studied before. I'm gonna start with chapter 1. The one thing needful. An empty schoolroom. An unnamed character shows his desire for teaching his students nothing but facts and focusing on the facts only. So here, Charles Dickens, in his literary satire Hard Times, shows us the society of England during the Industrial Revolution. And here we have the theme of mechanization of human nature, because poor people or people who work in the factories were treated like machines, not people who have feelings and imagination, because they have to do the same work every day and they were focused on the facts and work only. As we mentioned before, Dickens was concerned about the life of poor people and their misery. So Hard Times, or this novel, is the one of the famous novel that deals with this kind of subjects directly. At the end of this chapter, we have the repetition of the reference square, square coat, square legs, square shoulder, etc. Here Dickens described this unnamed character as a square, and he compares this unnamed character to a box who's filled with facts and knowledge only. Moving now to chapter 2, Murdering the Innocents. Here we have the name of the character we have talked about before in chapter 1, Thomas Gradgrind, or Mr. Gradgrind. He starts describing himself as a man of realities, man of facts, who cares about facts and knowledge and numbers only. After that, we can imagine that Mr. Gradgrind and his students in the class asked them to define a horse, pointing specifically at girl number 20, which is the second character in this novel, Cecilia Jupe, or Sissy Jupe, whose father works in the ring, the circus in another meaning. When she told Mr. Gradgrind that her father works in the circus, he didn't like it and told her that your father is a horse breaker, to not make his students think of the circus and the fantasy world. And when she couldn't define a horse, of course, because she doesn't know the facts, he asked another student, Pitzer, to define it, who gave a good description of the horse, although Pitzer hadn't seen a horse before, but he learned the description from the facts, from the school or Mr. Gradgrind. And Cecilia, who saw the horse, couldn't define it because she doesn't know the facts. So Dickens here shows us the importance or the conflict between facts versus fantasy, or facts versus imagination. After that, we saw Mr. Gradgrind talking about the horse pictures and that they shouldn't put horse pictures on the wall because the horse couldn't walk on the sides of the rooms, and talks about the flowers on the carpet and the flowers couldn't grow on the floor. So Dickens here shows us that this character, or Mr. Gradgrind's character, is obsessed with the facts and avoiding imagination even in the smallest details. In another session, we have the appearance of the another character, which is Mr. Michukum Child, who enters the class and gave the students nothing but harsh and cold facts, as well as Mr. Gradgrind. So in this chapter, we have the conflict between these two characters, Mr. Gradgrind's characters, who represents the fact and reality world, and Cecilia's character, who represents imagination and fantasy world.
Now moving to chapter 3. Mr. Gradgrind walks back to his home, called the Stone Lodge. He thinks with satisfaction about the education of facts that his young children are receiving, both at home and at school. But he cannot believe his eyes when he sees his two children, Louisa Gradgrind and Tom Gradgrind, being into a circus tent. This circus, by the way, features a horse rider named Señor Job, who seems likely to be Sissy's father. In accordance with his beliefs that children should focus only on facts and not on imagination and fun, he angrily pulls them away from the circus. Louisa, who is 16 and a good deal older than her brother, speaks clearly in defense of herself, that her curiosity compelled her to get a glimpse of the circus, and tries to clear her brother of any blame by saying she brought him along. Mr. Gradgrind just scolds them as he takes them home. Then he adds, "What would Mr. Bounderby say?" In Chapter 4, Mr. Bounderby is described as a physically inflated, coarsely made man. He is standing in a stone lodge, boasting to the feeble Mrs. Gradgrind about his rags to riches background. He spent his youth living in a ditch, deserted by his mother, but worked his way up to his current wealth, position of manufacture. He is a close family friend, and takes an interest in the children, especially Louisa. Mr. Gradgrind returns with Louisa and Tom, having dragged them from the circus, and indignantly exposes the bad action of his children to his wife and to Bounderby. The two men discuss what should be done, and Bounderby, discovering that Sissy Job, whose father is inflated in the circus, goes to the same school as Louisa, decides that he should go into town and confront Sissy, who he thinks is likely a bad influence on Louisa. Mr. Gradgrind and Mr. Bounderby set off for Coketown to confront the Jobs. As they leave, Mr. Bounderby plants a kiss on Louisa's cheek, who is disgusted by this show of affection from him.
Chapter 5 The K Nut. Mr. Gradgrind and Mr. Bounderby stroll into industrial Coketown, once a red brick town, but now discolored, having been blasted with ashes and smoke from the factories. Everything in the town looks identical and is immensely useful, and in short has been produced so as to produce maximally useful products. On their way to the Job's home, Gradgrind and Bounderby collide with Sissy Job and Pizza. Gradgrind finds, to his chagrin, that his star bill was mean-spirited cheering the young girl. Gradgrind asks frightened Sissy what she was doing and where she was going, and she tells the two gentlemen that she was going home to her father with bottle of oils from him that add to hell his process from circus. Mr. Bounderby is a coarse and insensitive in the way responds to his information and jeers at her and her father's way of the earning their living. Responds to Mr. Gradgrind's somewhat kinder question docilely leads them to where she and her father are staying. Chapter 6 Sleary's Horsemanship. Sissy leads Mr. Gradgrind and Bounderby into the pub called Bix's Arms, where she, her father, and the rest of the circus troupe are staying. She is greatly distressed, however, when she cannot find her father there and runs out to look for him in the circus booth. As Gradgrind and Bounderby wait for her return, they meet some of the other members of the circus, Mr. E.W.B. Childrens and Mr. Kinderminster, who speaks in almost incomprehensible. The circus people reveal that Sissy's father had not been performing very well lately, and that he in fact deserted Sissy, whom he loved dearly, because of his shame in his failure to earn their living. As Gradgrind and Bounderby discussed what they ought to do with this now fatherless child, the rest of the circus company comes in, including the circus owner, Mr. Sleary. They are dirty, poor, but they are also kind, gentle, and are very sad to hear that Sissy may be leaving them. Sissy returns in tears upon discovering her father's desertion and accepts Mr. Gradgrind's offers to take her into his home and education her. The circus players, who all loved Sissy dearly, sadly say goodbye to her and show her a lot of affection in their simple and sincere way.
Chapter 7 Mrs. Sparsit. Mrs. Sparsit, Bounderby's housekeeper, is a widow and a proud descendant of two prominent, in her mind anyway, families. Her husband was a bowler while she herself is a scatters. Bounderby loves having her as a servant. She has fallen from high society, and so makes him look even better for climbing as high from the gutter as he has climbed. Bounderby tells Mrs. Sparsit about Gradgrind's plans for Cece, and his own worries that she will be a bad influence on Louisa. Mrs. Sparsit praises Bounderby for being quite another father to Louisa, but he says that if he is another father to anyone, it's to Tom. In fact, Tom is coming to work for him at the bank very soon. The two banter a bit about how rich and upper-class Mrs. Sparsit used to be and how low-class and poor Bounderby used to be. Gradgrind, Louisa, and Cece come to Bounderby's house. Cece is shy and confused. She bows a greeting to everyone except by mistake. Mrs. Sparsit and Bounderby yells at her. Gradgrind formally offers Cece a place in his house as a sort of companion and servant to the sickly Mrs. Gradgrind. She accepts, but says that as soon as her father returns, she will leave the Gradgrinds. Chapter 8 Never Wonder. This chapter's title is explained by a quick memory. Louisa, about 9 years old, one day starts a conversation with Tom. I wonder. To which her father quickly answers, Louisa, never wonder. This is Gradgrind's hobby horse in nutshell. Obviously, and so much so that he is really stressed about the fact that Cooktown has a library, and that Works use that library to read novels about made-up strangers. Yes, clearly he is a few fries short of a happy meal. Moving on. Tom complains to Louisa, that he really hates everything about his life and thinks their house is a jaundiced jail. That's got a nice ring to it, doesn't it? He tells her that as soon as he can get the heck out of there, he is going to go wild to make up for lost time. Basically, he is going to be a college freshman on a bender. Louisa worries that Bounderby won't really be into that kind of behavior from one of his employees. Tom laughs and tells her that he is got a trick to handle Bounderby. Ready for it? The trick is Louisa, since Bounderby has the hots for Louisa, and will probably ask her to marry him. Louisa will have the power to make Bounderby nice to Tom. Louisa slow and sadly acquiesces to Tom's demands. She sits and stares at the fire in the fireplace, confessing that she has unmanageable thoughts that will wander. At which point her mother comes in to repeat her father's earlier phrase forbidding any wandering of any kind. And you thought your parents don't really get you.